It wasn't that long ago that we heard the call, "The Queen is dead, the Queen is dead." And immediately in its wake, "Long live the King, long live the King." With certain transitions, it can be vital to move from one era to another. The speedy transition from one royal leader to another is not meaningful today, but does call back to a time when it was important for England to move quickly from one sovereign to the next. In our nation, we place a similar importance on the transitions from one president to the next. And this is particularly acute when a president dies in office. On November 22nd of 1963, Lyndon Baines Johnson was sworn into office as president 90 minutes after President Kennedy was declared dead. We Jews do a similar thing, but of course not with respect to our sovereign, as God is eternal, but with regard to our Sefer Torah, which we treat similarly to how we would treat a sovereign. As we saw, Harold basically took a bullet for our Sefer Torah a little earlier, right? That's what we would do for our leader. We clothe it in finery, with decorative tapestry. Our Torah wears a crown of precious metal and a breastplate as well. And we read through our entire Sefer Torah each year. And then on Simchat Torah, we end the reading of one year's cycle and immediately begin the reading of next year's cycle. Similar to the King or Queen of England or a US president, we are never between leaders. Well, in each of these cases, and for very good reasons, when the leader is a head of state, we front load the transition to what is next, and we put off mourning what we have lost until after that transition is secure. After President Kennedy was assassinated, we wanted there to be no question about who the legitimate leader of the free world was. Well, one of our wisest Jewish traditions is centered around doing things in the opposite direction. When we bury a loved one, we return to their home or to our own home to sit Shiva. Our friends and our family, they bring us food and consolation. Our community, they bring us a minyan so we can say Kaddish. We cocoon ourselves off from the world for those 7 days. In Shiva, we mourn. There is no transition to what comes next. As we gather here this sacred and solemn Yom Kippur morning, we gather here to mourn those we have lost. And as with any year, we mourn those whom we have lost from our own family, and we also acknowledge the loss of martyrs of the Jewish people in the past year. And as with any year, we mourn those we have lost in the past year, and we mourn those we have lost in decades gone by. But this year, as we know, is also very different. Because this year, in our martyrs section, we have to include all of the Jews, the Arabs, the Bedouin, the Filipino, and the Thai, and others who were murdered in a Kiddush Hashem, murdered for simply being a part of Israel. Well, as we mourn these individuals, we have an obligation to remember them in the spirit of our prayer El Malei Rachamim, where we refer to their holy and pure souls, Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim, that shine like the splendor of the heavens. Our obligation is to remember them in the best possible light. I find having this to remember, this reminder to remember them in this way, to be especially helpful in this moment, as our thoughts about these martyrs can too easily be impacted but what we learn of their political opinions and behaviors. Well, I hope one thing you have learned of me over this past year is that I have a deep love for Israel. And you might also sense I have some very strong opinions about Israel, even as I try to make space in our community for other perspectives. Well, on October 7th, death did not discriminate. And as we remember them, we must love each of them with loving eyes equally. One martyr we mourn this morning was a humble, powerful, and inspiring grandmother, a member of Kibbutz Be'eri. Canadian by birth, Vivian Silver made Aliyah in 1974. Now, Vivian was a loving mother and a grandmother whose backyard was littered with her grandchildren's toys and would literally spend days preparing for their visits. Vivian, and you'll notice that I do my best to avoid referring to these martyrs with pronouns because I want to use their names as much as possible, even if it might be awkward at times. Vivian was a member of Women Wage Peace, a group she founded after the 2014 war in Gaza, and had only returned on Friday, October 6th, from the group's peace rally in Yerushalayim. Now, Vivian herself had organized this rally, bringing together thousands of Israeli and Palestinian women from Gaza and the West Bank to make the statement, Israeli and Palestinian women are determined to change the reality of the conflict. Vivian dedicated her life to building connections and understanding between Jews and Palestinians. She also participated in the organization On the Way to Recovery, a group of Israelis who transport Palestinians of Gaza to hospitals in Israel when they need life-saving care. And in fact, because of her relationships, Vivian's first warning of the attack and massacre came from a friend of hers in Gaza. Alone in her house on Kibbutz Be'eri, before she even realized this massive attack and massacre were underway, Vivian received a phone call from one of her old friends in Gaza trying to warn her. Vivian, what's going on? What's happening? We hear civilians and soldiers have been kidnapped, and they're already in Gaza. The pictures look horrible. Where is your army? That was her warning. But she did not survive. And along with Vivian, we mourn so many. And this morning, I share with you the story of an Israeli from a very different background and who held very different political beliefs. Chaim Ben Aryeh was an Israeli who led a very different life. The son of immigrants from Iraq and Turkey, Chaim drove an armored bus among the settlements of Gaza. He met his wife Irit when she begged for a spot on his already full bus heading back to Gaza from Tel Aviv. They had been at a protest against the Oslo Accords together. Well, that was enough for them, and once married a short time later, they made their home in Gaza on Moshav Katif. Chaim was known for his patience and his kindness. Making his stops to pick up children on their way to school each morning, he was known to wait an extra minute if one of them had not shown up, thinking that perhaps they were just running a few minutes late. He knew each of them by name and family background. Chaim's actions tell you that he saw himself as more than a simple nahag, a driver. And many of us have experienced drivers like Chaim in Israel, special people who look out for the well-being of their charges, people who make you feel that your safety and welfare on not just their job, but their mission. Well, Chaim and Irit were also opposed in 2004 to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's disengagement plan. And when they lost that vote, and the time had come to leave their home in Moshav Katif, they waited until the very last minute, seemingly unable to believe that it was really happening. Dropped off at a girls' school that night, they didn't know where they would make their home. Sadly, it took 14 years for the government of Israel to resettle 50 families from Moshav Katif. They established a new Moshav in the Otef, in that envelope around Gaza, called Moshav Katif, called Karmi Katif. And those years of being unsettled exacted a deep emotional price on them all. But no one seemed to pay a higher price than Chaim. But with the new home, things seemed to be returning to normal. Chaim seemed to be refining his way again. But then on October 7th, his bus company called upon him to take his bus to Kibbutz Be'eri, that same kibbutz that Vivian was murdered on. They wanted him to transport survivors of the massacre to hotels at the Dead Sea. Knowing his sensitive nature and his special ability to handle delicate situations, especially with children, they thought that he was the perfect person for the job. Irit reports that he returned from this sacred mission around 4 a.m. Hearing the key turn in the door, Irit went to check on him and found him crying in a way she had never seen before. "What happened?" she asked. "I couldn't help them," was his reply. "I'm sure you did help them," she reassured him. But then he shared with her that people boarded my bus half naked. They were wrapped in blankets and towels. The blood, people were covered in blood. Children covered in blood. Children without socks or shoes, fathers in their underwear. They ran for their lives. These people saw their families murdered. The most horrible images. And the silence. The entire 2-hour drive to the Dead Sea was totally silent. My bus was full and no one said a word. Even the babies weren't crying. Not a single child said a single word. And what could I do? I couldn't do anything. I couldn't help them. The experience of being unable to help these people was too much for him. He withdrew into himself, and unable to bear the pain, he died by suicide on October 25th. But we know that it was really Hamas that pulled the trigger. Now, I selected the stories of Vivian and Chaim to share with you this morning because they have to represent so many more. And in doing so, I'm mimicking a literary device of the Tanakh called the Hendiades, which uses two nouns separated by the word "and" to represent a larger or more complex idea, just as these two martyrs have to represent so many more. In the Tanakh, think of Eretz v'Shamayim, which is literally earth and heavens, but when used together in that way stands for the entire world. Vivian and Chaim were two empathic Israelis who were mission-oriented with deep love for Israel and the Jewish people. And it is hard to imagine two Israelis more diametrically opposed to one another in their politics. But in Yizkor, our task is to go beyond simply remembering the loved ones we have lost this past year. Our tradition challenges us to examine their lives, to learn from their examples, and to find lessons we can apply in our own lives. In any year, Chaim and Vivian's lives could teach any of us a number of valuable lessons. But this year, as we consider how our people and Medinat Yisrael will move forward, we must look to a third story to remind us that whatever choices Israel makes, there are people who will pay the price for those decisions. Matan Arbagil, a 19-year-old Golani soldier, was on duty the morning of October 7th. Like Omer Nutra, he was at the border as part of a first response team. Sitting around their namer, their APC or armored personnel carrier, he and his fellow soldiers were joking around, drinking coffee at 6 a.m. when they saw the first rockets fired from Gaza headed toward Israel, and they got the call that an infiltration had been sighted at Kibbutz Nir Am between Sderot and Gaza. Not knowing that this was really an invasion of thousands, not just an infiltration of a few, they jumped into their namer and they headed out. But quickly they realized that this was a different situation than they had expected, as they witnessed a whole sea of terrorists coming at them on motorcycles, on foot, and in pickup trucks. And they immediately began to fight, shooting as they continued on their way to the kibbutz. Once they arrived and they left that namer, they took back buildings that had been occupied by terrorists, and Matan's commander described him as being in overdrive, kicking in doors, totally fearless. Later, they were guarding the namer as they waited for their commander to return from another mission. Exposed to the enemy and without their commander, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by 30 or 40 terrorists. Quickly, they ran back inside their safety, but outnumbered, as anti-tank missiles and explosive devices were thrown at them, their vehicle was quickly immobilized. Matan was the first to act. He opened one of the hatches and began to return fire. Other soldiers followed his example, but then eventually Matan was shot in the hand. Someone took his place as he struggled to change the magazine of his gun with only one hand. Suddenly, another soldier firing from another hatch was shot in the shoulder. Falling back into the vehicle, the terrorists took advantage of the open hatch, and they managed to throw a grenade into the namer. Matan was the first to see it. He tried to grab it to throw it back out, but with only one usable hand, he fumbled for a second or two. Quickly, he realized that he was out of time to throw it back out of the vehicle. Instead, he pressed it to his chest, he turned away from his friends, and he took the blast. He took the blast entirely in his body. In the arms of his friends as the medic tried to save him, some of his last words were, "I did everything I could for my country and my friends." Before too long, a team of border police arrived to rescue them. And because of Matan, every other soldier in that namer was saved. Our ancient Rabbi Hillel taught us, Ohev shalom v'rodev shalom, to love peace and pursue peace. We all share in Vivian's hope for peace, even as we each have our own ideas about how to pursue that elusive goal. We must always remember that peace between peoples most often emerges from the most surprising of sources. We pray to be surprised this year. And at Slichot, our guest, Israeli journalist Lee Yaron, the author of 10:7, she shared with us that some, like Vivian in the Peace Camp, are only more committed to the path of grassroots bridge building, and others have been convinced that it is no longer the way, at least at this moment. None of us own the answer or the truth. Well, as we've learned over the past year, many Israelis who dedicated themselves to building bridges with Palestinians in Gaza over politics and even through war, lived in the Otef and were murdered on October 7th. We know that Hamas terrorists had maps of the kibbutzim that labeled houses with the names of specific families, their units and ranks in the IDF and other associations. They didn't just attack Israel, they deliberately sought to murder specific people. And whatever our political opinions are, we must not also allow Hamas to murder the ideas that they stood for. That's our obligation. But as I've recounted to you the stories of three heroes, each who had dedicated their lives to Israel and the Jewish people in different ways, we see that theirs are extraordinary stories. But we also must remember that they are also the stories of three unique and flawed human beings who loved and who were loved. Our tradition teaches us that each person is unique and irreplaceable, and that the loss of each represents the loss of an entire world. These stories speak to us of so much more, and yet, to their parents and siblings or children and grandchildren, they were beautiful worlds whose flaws made them perfect. Just like the loved ones we are about to recall and honor through our Yizkor service. But now I ask that you please stand with me as we first say one Yizkor prayer for those murdered on October 7th, and then continue with our traditional service.